Hello and welcome to Laurice's Kitchen. Back when I was in the Marine Corps, out in the fields and away from a chow hall, we got stuck eating MREs. Now they weren't all terrible, and in fact parts of them were quite delicious. My favorite was a maple walnut cake that was part of the MREs of the late 80s. When I contacted Natick Labs about this particular recipe, they didn't have it, but they did have a recipe for the cherry nut cake that was in later MREs. Sadly, I found out that none of these cakes are included in the current MREs. So tonight, I'm putting together the cherry nut cake. Now it doesn't have the same shelf life as an MRE, but longevity aside, it tastes delicious. So let's see what we're gonna need. Before we get started on the cake batter, we have to prepare our cake pan. This was the stickiest cake I have ever worked with, which is why my non-stick cake pan is coated in cooking spray. Then every square inch of that is covered in parchment paper, and all of that is covered in cooking spray. There's also no baking instructions because this cake was never meant to be baked. It was dispensed into retort pouches, sealed, and processed. The ingredients list was also given as a percentage of a total weight, which after some tedious math, I converted into grams. So you are going to need a food scale to put this cake together. Like all good cakes, we're going to start by creaming together our fat and sugar. This cake requires two specialty ingredients. The first of which is this high ratio shortening. Now we'll need 104 grams of it. This particular shortening has mono and diglycerides added for shelf stability after you package your baked goods. If you were to just use regular shortening, the fats would separate and you'd end up with a greasy piece of cake. Now if you don't plan to package this cake, you can just use regular shortening. For our sugar, we need 250 grams. That works out to 1 cup, 1 tablespoon, and a half teaspoon. We're going to cream this together with our shortening until it's light and fluffy, and that is going to take a little bit of time. The next thing we need to add is 100 grams of eggs, which works out to exactly 2 large eggs. This leads me to believe this might have been developed as a 9 by 13 inch cake. Okay, we're scraping down the sides again. For the last of our wet ingredients, we have a teaspoon of almond extract. We're moving on to our dry ingredients. This is 185 grams of cake flour and 6 grams of baking powder. This brings us to our second specialty ingredient, which is modified food starch. We're using 15 grams of it. Now before you flip out about chemicals, modified food starch is nothing more than cornstarch or arrowroot or both, mixed with water and heated until it forms a gel. The gel is then dehydrated and pulverized into this powder. The benefit is it can thicken liquids at room temperature. I have 6 grams of kosher salt and 52 grams of water, which works out to exactly 1/4 cup. To avoid salty pockets in the cake, I'm going to dissolve the salt in the water. Before we add our dry ingredients and salty water to the cake batter, we want to make sure that we have our fruit and nuts measured out. This is 303 grams of candied cherries and 182 grams of walnuts that I've placed into the food processor and then pulsed into small pieces. We're going to be adding our dry ingredients and water half at a time and mixing in between. Now we don't want to overmix because according to the people at Natick Labs, that can produce a gummy product. My oven is preheated to 325 degrees and I do have the convection oven on. Now I've tried this cake both with the convection and without the convection oven and it just works perfectly with the fan. If you don't have a convection oven, you may need to rotate your cake halfway through baking. We're going to bake it for 30 minutes. We want to spread this evenly in the pan. We want this cake to be slightly underdone, so we're depanning it immediately. And this is where the parchment paper comes in handy. Now that this cake is completely cool, we can either eat it or package it. I'm going to be packaging it using my vacuum sealer. Now if we're going to do that, we have to cut off the crusts first because those don't vacuum seal properly. We also have to determine how big of a piece to cut. Now I used to cut this cake into 6 pieces, but 1/6 of a cake was just too much for one person. Now I cut it into 8 pieces and it works perfectly. So we don't want to cut off too much. Whatever you do, don't throw away these crusts. They're delicious. I'm using my 8-inch bags. These are also called quarts, and this will probably take a little bit of trial and error. I used to make these way too big, but you really don't want to waste these bags too much. This is probably only about 6 inches, and that's all I'm going to need to seal the bottom and then put it in the top. Now when we seal this, we have to pull the sides out and the bottom. Otherwise, it will just crush in because this cake is still a little bit soft. While it looks like these may last forever, they won't. None of this was sterile when we put it in here, and there are several food pathogens that can grow in a vacuum-sealed environment. So, since we're not yet in the apocalypse, just throw all of this in your freezer. Then it will last forever. You can take them out and use them for up to a week safely. 2 might be pushing it. Let's give one of these a taste. Before we cut into this, because that is the only way that you can get into this, you can't just tear it. This is no longer flimsy cake. It's now durable cake. Also, I'm using my Leatherman's tool because that's what I'd have with me when I camp. Well, it looks like an MRE cake. Nice and dense. This is so perfect. This is 185 grams of cake flour and 6 grams of baking soda, baking powder. This is 185 grams of cake flour and 6 grams of baking soda powder. Damn it! The benefits are that this can thicken liquids at room temperature.